now that we've beat the horse dead for sure in the
Oh,
logo,
man.
there's more. There's more to this brand.
It's not immediately obvious. There's so many ways you could interpret this.
I see the square logo, and it's much more rigid and calculated than I think Frank Lloyd Wright buildings feel.
It should be focused on the buildings themselves. Like, that's really the character of the whole thing.
A better way to articulate what I'm trying to get at is it feels anonymous.
The Apple look, there's a similar concept that's happening there.
But they don't go so far as to transform the square into something that's not just a square. Hello, and welcome back to the Brand Design Critique Podcast, a podcast where we critique design pretty neutrally and in better format than you usually see, hopefully, on social media. I'm your host, Caleb Dean, and today again with Miles. Miles, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Doing good. A little chilly here. I've got my little space heater in my garage, so I'm not doing too bad.
Oh, that's perfect. That's so funny. I'm right by my garage. It's on the other side. So I'm always using the space heater because it is the coldest room in the house.
I've insulated the walls. I have like nice lights. People don't understand that this like really nice recording studio is only about 36 inches square.
Excellent.
I've got a mattress holding in the heat on that side. So
that's perfect.
High tech.
No one needs to see it. No one needs to see the mattress.
Don't look behind the man behind the curtain. Today we're going to talk about a brand I think we're both like really in love with the work of the brand, or at least the like driver, what the thing being identified, the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy. It's a mouthful as a brand. Yeah. There's a ton of great work.
Beautiful. We like that clean space.
This brand is pretty recent, and I just wanted to note that it was done by Order. They're awesome. I really love their stuff. They have a design studio, and they take on huge clients, huge projects. They've built a brand guidelines sort of hosting platform called Standards. They have a little type agency.
Fantastic.
Standards is fantastic. So they're really awesome. The whole aggregate of what Order is doing really awesome. I'm going to let you take a stab at it first. What are your initial thoughts? Yeah.
And I can give a little background too. It's kind of funny. I do have a relationship with Frank Lloyd Wright in a sense because I went to school in the Midwest. I went to Madison, University of Madison, Wisconsin. And he has, first of all, Taliesin's in Wisconsin. So a beautiful example of architecture. And he actually designed them. It's been a long time, but I think it's called Monona Terrace. So it's on the lake. It's a beautiful building. It just leads right there. And like his typical style, it really blends in well with the natural environment. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this has a special place in my heart, along with like the Eames Foundation, similar kind of vibe of the time to have this kind of like muted color thing and the very gridded application. But, for Frank Lloyd Wright, having this organic integration with nature is still kind of rare, I think. Only like architects like Bjarke Ingels, if I'm pronouncing it right. So hope I didn't slaughter his name. Right? I mean, absolutely stunning, but it's so rare because most buildings are still very, cut and paste looking to me, even the new home style. So yeah, it's nice to see someone tackle something with such a legacy of innovation.
Well, if we're going to go to our connections to Frank Lloyd Wright before we dive in, when I studied in Chicago, or I was in Chicago for about 10 years, there's three or four right in that area, including the Wisconsin one. And one of them is the Roby House. And the Roby House, my wife and I, my wife photographs weddings and I help her. And so we have actually shot at and spent many hours at the Roby House.
Love it.
It's just like this really discreet. It's on sort of north side of Chicago, and it's just tucked away. You don't notice it. You drive by it not thinking much of it. It's got a beautiful facade to it, and then you get into it, and it's everything everybody exclaims their love for about Frank Lloyd Wright and his work. So
that's amazing. I never went there, so next time.
It's obviously rentable, and you can stay in it, and which is really phenomenal.
We also have Hollyhock House, now that I'm coming up to that,
Yeah, yeah.
in Barnesdale Park, and that's where they filmed The Studio, which is Seth Rogen's show, and you can
Okay.
take tours, and he did this beautiful graphic of Hollyhock that's like thematic throughout the building.
So we're both obviously fans. I think it's hard to be a designer of any capacity and not be a fan. It's got to be a combination of like how incredible the work is and that his name touches every classroom of design at some juncture. Most of these images that I've pulled today are from the orders documentation of the project. This one here being a photo of him working in the foundation archives for the Museum of Modern Art. Just a phenomenal photo. Like, I've never seen my grandfather in a suit looking that dapper, especially doing any work. And here he is, and you're like, of course this gentleman designed some of the most beautiful houses in the world. He's in a suit and tie in the archive space, somehow in the middle of work, also looking straight out of a James Bond movie.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully not the villain. I heard he was a little challenging to work with, but sometimes that's, the geniuses can be difficult and particular. Yes, we should have worn suits, actually.
We should
Have a suit this time,
we should have worn suits. I would have not had to have been in my garage for sure. We'll just take a minute to describe the logo in case anybody is listening on a commute or if anybody hasn't seen it yet. It's a grid of 4x4 squares, 4x4 with what would be A3 on a chessboard missing.
Absolutely.
And then it's paired with a really, really lovely and of the times typeface. That was designed by a designer from Optimo Type Foundry. I've got his stuff documented later on. Pretty neutrally set. I think the idea is that the Conservancy wants to note that we don't want these things missing from design history. That's my draw of it. Is that we have this grid and we have this thing going on, and now that so many of these properties are still in like a public domain, like just civilians own them, that I think there's a worry that they're going to go away. And I think that that's the idea behind this missing piece. Like, we don't want to lose this piece of design history. So our goal is to be a conservancy over those things. That's how I read it. That's how I understand it and what it's aiming for. But we can chat more about it. I've got plenty of documentation here too.
Yeah, I mean, even though it's a piece missing, and it starts here in the presentation on black as an all-white edition of the logo, there's something to me that also reads as like the last person in the building keeping their light on. So it's also just the absolute dedication to a craft that you can see in this grid.
Sure.
You're gonna there's all these windows because he was so focused on buildings, but there's always that one or two, like in some places like New York or wherever, where you see these tall buildings, and there's someone there. There's someone. Each window is like a little story. So I see that on the grid too.
I like that take on it. The sort of last light in the building. There's some really beautiful documentation from Order here. They pulled a lot of really nice archival documents. I love the Frank Lloyd Wright archive logo, the WR monogram where ligature with the TH ligature at the end, like really amazing typography that's so of the time and really fitting for the architectural style. I know that the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation.org uses that as its primary logo, which is interesting that there's two separate organizations.
It is. And I love that they've shown us something into the process, because that does feel somewhat rare. It's more increasing now, kind of like your DVD extras back in the 90s. But it's an interesting choice. And I wonder why it is that they have this very quirky, almost Art Deco looking square logo with the type forms being, as you pointed out, ligatures that are somewhat unexpected. But when they took the type or used the type, designed the type to be paired with the logo, it's a lot more conservative in that sense. And maybe that is the idea behind, Foundation's logo. Maybe you don't want to get too quirky, but I could have seen something maybe in there. I mean, I guess already having a grid with one thing out of it, you don't want to have too many what we would call violators in the
Sure.
logo, so you don't get your focus distracted. But it is interesting that it's less quirky, consider.
There you have this frame here where there's looks like either a typewriter or some kind of letterpressed letter that he would have signed. It would seem it's like trimmed right at the top there, but the letter forms coming out of that using the typeface reply, which was drawn by Francois Repeau. Also, forgive me if I'm butchering that, of Optimo, which I think is like a really beautiful version. The typeface is really gorgeous, and I have no
It is.
problem with the typeface.
Oh, I agree too. I mean, it's reminiscent to me, for the design nerds out there, a little bit of Cable, a little bit of Futura. It's got this
Yep.
rounded, very geometric, but also somewhat humanist in there, because it feels soft. It doesn't feel too hard in terms of its use of geometry.
Just trying to find some slides with more text. Here, again, there's really some lovely characters. Futura is a great callback. The double overlapping W is really wonderful. It
is.
It also feels like that.
It's a nice moment. It's a really nice moment.
Art Deco moment from this earlier one. I pull it up and it doesn't have the double over, but that feels much more Art Deco as a decision than some of the others.
It does, and it feels supportive. It's structural, and almost feels like it's something that's carrying. So that as a moment does stand out in the logo. Also, the upward facing E, and I hope I'm remembering this correct, with Cable. I think Cable had that, the crossbar of the lowercase e does go up like that. So that's a little bit on the quirkier side.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's probably a nice balance, is maybe the typography and the choice of font helps balance out the quirkiness with the rigidity that I feel in the Square logo. I see the Square logo and it's much more rigid and calculated than I think Frank Lloyd Wright buildings feel. And
I agree with that. That's one thing that stood out to me as well. And I understand that decision, but it's almost as if there's a couple of slides up, like slide 7, I think it is, where you're showing a red square that he had. And what's nice about the image on the right is it has this grit. There's a grain, and there's almost this, it's not a gradient, but there's a little more orange to this. Like it's not as even. And that's something I feel would have been really nice in this identity, to have a little bit of that texture, because to me, I think organic, even this little square here, it's not quite perfect. That's something I feel in the grid. It's become very, very gridded, but doesn't necessarily have that organic feel. Same with the colors, because they're solid colors, even though they're well selected. Like, I almost want to have some texture in there.
Yeah. Here's a great color slide that they're pulling out. They did such a good job in the documentation of this project, like trying to show us the rationale behind all the decisions, which is really a great way to make a case study airtight, right? But to me, like we said, that the idea of Frank Lloyd Wright house is like, yes, he's super fundamentalist in the shapes that he uses and the forms that he uses, but the extremity to which they go is far beyond any other use case for those shapes and modules. And that's what maybe a tension point for me in this is, that this is fundamentally, yes, they're very simple squares we're putting into a grid, but they don't go so far as to transform the square into something that's not just a square. Like, it's a square and it stays a square, and we're missing a square.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to make a lot of statements and conjecture about that if I wanted to go into maybe where I thought they were going with the process. And maybe it is something to speak to the original grid, because he was clearly precise in his work and there are a lot of gridded elements. And then using that same basis, and obviously it's later on in the deck here, but to form things that are almost like tangrams off of that grid, and use them almost illustratively or for I don't know if we would consider those icons, but sort of building icons, if you will.
Yeah, we can pull those up. I don't have an order we need to go in.
Yeah, exactly. It has that tangrams, constructed kind of feel.
I would say that these are the sort of moments that I miss in the primary logo. Like I
Yeah.
understand that it would be really challenging to design this one icon that oversees all these others, but we don't even get a hint of the pieces that these ones are made out of in the initial one. And I think that to me feels like a missed opportunity and makes the top logo fall a little bit flatter than the characteristics of a Frank Lloyd Wright piece of work.
Yeah, like as an entry point, I feel like we're missing a bit of the character that's there because if you study him and you look at the buildings and I mean to the point of that slide with the red square that he used, it's absolutely relevant, of course, but it's that translation maybe to new folks who might be less familiar, like new generations and whatnot, where if you just see this grid of squares, it doesn't immediately call upon him, and that's where I feel like that emotional component actually might be missing.
Also, this is just an off the cuff. I have one man building websites in the place of people who have built websites in the past. The favicon of Bluehost haunts me. And when I immediately saw the Frank Lloyd Wright one and thought about Bluehost, because it's just this grid of 3x3 and it's, complete and not missing a piece. I also like think about the Windows logo quite a bit, and having taught design, some of the foundational exercise of design, we used to have these 1-inch black squares and we'd give adjectives to students and ask them to create a composition that fulfilled a certain set of adjectives using only X number of black squares. And the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy logo feels like an outcome of that sort of design basics exercise. So on one hand, it's really nice for that because of the simplicity and brevity in what it's trying to say and how it's achieving it. But on the other hand, for me, it misses a little bit, like you said, of the characteristics of a Frank Lloyd Wright building.
Yes, and there's something else that I love doing this with you because we're doing some research, we're putting this together, but a lot of what we're saying is off the cuff. And I think it's good to call that out because it keeps us fresh to this and honest and not really putting in a lot of extra stuff that we may have read from someone else. So we're really mostly looking at the elements themselves. Now, looking at this slide in particular and seeing the comparison, it also triggered another comparison for me. We don't have this on a slide, but it's the Apple logo because there's a similar concept that's happening there. Like if you were just to put a complete apple, you miss out on a concept, right? But the bite out of it is critical because it's the story of Newton that comes immediately back to that. I think with this one, there's so many ways to interpret this, and both of ours I think are valid and would work for this particular foundation, but it doesn't have that, okay, this is our intended story. It's not immediately obvious. There's so many ways you could interpret this where it could start to get into things that maybe aren't as relevant and don't feel, specifically building oriented even.
Maybe that's a good way a better way to articulate what I'm trying to get at is it feels anonymous a little bit. It doesn't feel of Frank Lloyd Wright when he had such a strong characteristic in design and the things that he made that were so easily recognizable. Like anyone who's looked at his work or familiar with it could be presented a catalog of 200 buildings and know which one or two were his really quite quickly. And that to me, the anonymity in this logo is where it falls down a little bit for me.
Yeah, I wonder where that human element could have come in, for instance. So I don't offhand remember what his handwriting is like. And that kind of, not that you would want that in there. I mean, that's one way to do things. I mean, it's always, oh, right, there you go. So probably not so legible.
However, though, like when I look at his capital F writing there, like there's a tile with it impressed there and the really sketchy sort of signature there. like even the way his F is framed and stacked has the similar cantilever style to his architecture.
Yeah.
And that seems so fascinating. I've never seen, I don't think anybody had ever seen so many buildings with pieces that jutted out over the foundation until he came along and started to do those things. And this F is the same way. Like, why in the world there's strokes heading to the left instead of just to the right seems indicative of his architectural style. And
I really like that tool that you just made. I mean, honestly, that's interesting. Like, even if it had not that we need to design verbally,
no.
but just spitballing here a little bit, if it had been like kind of an offset grid like that, then it has that feeling of cantilevering. Yeah.
Now that we've beat the horse dead for sure in the logo, there's more to this brand. Order is a great brand builder, and it does help in its brand application. They have tons of documentation of stuff that may or may not even be alive yet, but they've got brochures and postcards and posters and all sorts of things that I think they each individually push the logo further back. And that, for me, the further we get away from the logo, the better the brand gets.
Agreed. And I mean, it really allows the architecture to be the buildings, I mean, to shine. And it doesn't try to overimpose itself. So, I mean, we just said what we said about the entry point. But that said, seeing it pushed back was a really wise decision, because it should be focused on the buildings themselves. Like, that's really the character of the whole thing. And it brings already such character. So a good photo is going to carry up very far.
Yeah. And having photographed at one of his houses, it's really hard to take a bad picture of his stuff. There's so many places that are designed for a single viewpoint, right? There's the observer coming into the entryway and this grandeur that happens there, and then the rest of it is super utilitarian. And you can tell when having photographed there, it was like, no matter where you are, where you went, the compositions just throw themselves at you. And I have some images here that are just because I knew I had other angles of them. Like, there's a couple and they're walking they're along the side fence. So there was a side fence that you could go on at the Roby house. And this walkway is like, there's more design happening in the walkway than there is in most other buildings around it. It's ways to the left, and there's a solid concrete wall, and then there's a brick wall, and then it ramps up so that you are, at one point, you're sunken into the landscape, and then you find yourself where you would normally be in the landscape, which is like, it's down at your feet level. And the whole experience is like, just walking to the backyard is gorgeous.
And are those apertures, like, you can see through them?
Yeah. So these ones there are the same ones on the back and the front of that house.
That's such a lovely moment.
And they're almost the same size as those windows, which are in that house is just a huge, long gathering space and dining space, which is probably absolutely against my notion of having perfect squares in the logo. But
right. And I mean, it's interesting, even evolving our thinking as we go along. It's so funny. I find that in a lot of conversations these days, people pick one viewpoint, they read one thing, they stick to that viewpoint. It doesn't really change. I mean, I think it's great that we can, even in the course of going through all these slides, almost reevaluate how we're perceiving something, because you're seeing two designers go through this and literally have a change of opinion as you see different aspects of the system.
I mean, it's just so gray, right? Like, one thing can feel on one end of the spectrum and the other end can be the other end. And then someday I'll visit that house again. I'm sure these brochures will be in that house, and I'll pick one up and say, this is gorgeous,
There's something else interesting too. Like, I would have been curious to see, I don't know how they did this particular grid, but because it is such a grid that obviously lends itself to using that grid, a square grid, very classic kind of Swiss style design in the 50s and 40s and whatnot.
Yep.
I hope I didn't misquote that. I think 40s is probably accurate, but 50s, anyway.
Yeah. through the
But
70s at least.
to see that applied specifically to these layouts, like maybe that's how they did it. It looks like it could be, but that's really interesting.
The more that I look at these, like this slide in particular, these deliverables, I think there's this other slide where there's these repeated postcards, and with the sort of logo icon that big, I'm not in love with what's happening in these ones compositionally, but in this suite of things, it does feel of the era. And I know that Order, like if you look at Order's work, a lot of their big brand stuff and a lot of their more recent work is very high Swiss modernism. It's like it is their bread and butter. If any big agency or agency who's big enough to handle these kind of stuff is still doing it, it's them.
Yeah,
And they've studied it more than anybody else because their publishing firm, their publishing arm has put out so many revitalized brand guidelines of the era that I'm sure they know it like nobody else does these days.
Sure.
It does feel of that ilk. In this slide, I just love that we're actually giving full bleed to some of these images, which, like you said, it's about the architecture and it's about the building.
Yep.
The typeface comes alive for me in these, and then they were foregoing the perfect grid and pulling in the pseudo grid drawings or renderings of Frank Lloyd Wright architecture. Feels like they're all the right choices to me.
It does. And even little details in the font itself, even though it's not specific to him, it's more era driven, derived, making a choice like a stacked A. We're hopefully not getting too in the weeds for fun. Also want to speak to designers who might be interested in this versus, I don't even know what it's called. Like, I guess single story A just has basically one circle to it, if you will, or oval. But a stacked, a double story, it has a circle, but then there's a little curved part on top of it. And that also, to me, is a good choice. Like, it can be tougher to read, but it gives it a little more character, and it does speak more to how he layered his buildings. So I think that really is a nice moment.
I think technically they're easier to read.
You think so?
Yeah, the dyslexic crowd would flip the A and make it, group it into the lowercase d, p, b, q.
I see. Right. Yeah, that's true. It could be more.
It's harder to flip visually, I think. I also include this slide as your brand builder, and if we're talking about brand making, their guidelines are nuts, right? I also love the little color studies in here. Like they have a very Albers study in there of like when to use black, when to use
absolutely the color contrast thing, like at the top there in the sort of middle. It's absolutely the Albers clown, if you will.
And I understand that that's to show when you use black on a color versus when you use white on a background. It would have been really fun to have them do an Albers study. I'm sure they did an Albers study, but especially with the breadth of colors they're using, feels really phenomenal. And then I would have loved to see those as sketches in the mismatched shaped buildings too, like just a plethora of colors. Who knows?
Yeah. There's also some other interesting moments in here. If we look in the middle, like underneath those Albers-esque studies are almost old school ways of presenting, like typebooks. So anyone who loves typography, and I would count many designers I know as folks that do, are these old typebooks. I mean, it's gotten more modernized. You might see it in a custom font house like a Dalton Mogg or something like that, but for the most part, we don't see them quite like that in modern guidelines. So it's nice to have a nod back to that era of putting together type specimen books for people to look through and be, see the full kit and make a selection.
Well, I 100% put a type specimen version like that in all my brand guidelines just for my own sake. It's like a little self-love. The ones that I think are funny are the scalability ones. It's got turned on the side and they're scaling it down.
No, right? Funky.
My advisor, Philip Burton at UIC, he actually taught with Paul Rand and Armin Hoffman over in Basel for a lot of years.
Wow.
They used to drink wine all the time, he would say.
That's amazing.
He told me about their initial IBM binders, because he used to have like a ton of the originals, because he was like, oh, well, Paul's got too many. He just gave some to me so that I could use them. I just gave them away. I didn't want them. They're like invaluable now, right? He used to say the scale logos like that were on perforated paper, so that you would take them off and then you'd take that to your printer and say, this is the scale that I want, so use this size. So it wasn't just like, here's what the logo looks like at that size. It was an execution tool of like, it can only be in these 6 sizes, no other sizes, which is
pre-digital, because now you can kind of do anything and scale at any level. But yeah, that's a good cue for folks who aren't accustomed to this type of thinking, is that it used to be that, and you'll see these actually when you look at some sort of softwares or applications, whatever thing you're using, you're calling it, but that you'll see certain point sizes, and those tended to be the common ones, and that's why those appear. Like, if you're looking at a 12 point, 14, 16, 21, 18, 20, that kind of a thing in those denominations. But now you can go in between, and we've got variable fonts, so it's a lot more flexible.
I say, everything I do now too is just relative to screen width. So it's how wide the screen is helps dictate how large the type is, so that you don't get lines that are too long or whatever else. And you can tell when a site does it, the whole thing shrinks and breathes and does it really beautifully. Like you said, though, totally abandoning any kind of dictatorial scaling system.
Right. And it's also interesting to note that what's changed is that the new field that developed with the advent of the web, they have a totally different language for how they do sizing. So that's always a thing you got to get right, is the conversation between a developer and a designer to ensure that way that they're looking, and I don't want to get into the weeds of that because it's going to bore a lot of people, but is, we're more or less looking at the same thing, even though the screens are different and the platforms are different and the environments are different. At least we can have a general understanding what the size proportion should be.
There's one more slide on this, or one more of their slides that I want to talk about on this slide, which is like the bottom middle, where they're almost revealing to us the pieces that you can use, right? It's got the square and then a square with a notch out of it, so they can make an arch, a half square, a doubled half square, probably a quarter square, a half diagonal, and then an arch. I think those elements are the pieces that I would have liked to see in the monogram itself, in some form, some composition. Like, they can still use a high Swiss grid or aggregate of how those pieces get together, but that feels really interestingly indicative of his work. But maybe there's too many architecture projects that do that. Like we said,
I wonder, right? Because it has that, I don't know if it's also like a play school set. I could be misremembering, but it certainly Tangrams has those set shapes. And that's the one thing too. I guess it's a conceptual consideration as to whether you want to use certain shapes that harken to another brand, even, because that's where, I mean, some of these, of course, are specific to him. He used squares. They're a universal type of shape. But let's say, were there other things that could have come to the fore? Or were there just elements in the architecture that were just too specific, so they went with more basic shapes and constructed the forms from there? But it does, to me, it alludes to other things and doesn't just stay in the Frank Lloyd Wright lane. In that sense.
Sure. Yeah, that could have easily been a danger of using these in a more forefront or playful way, that it becomes not about him specifically, but maybe architecture at all, right?
Right. So applied to the buildings, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. But there is an element of, and play is good too, of course, in like any brand, having a little bit of fun and flexibility. But it does, give that reference off to something.
Okay. Any last thoughts? A summary? Whatever you might else want to say about this before we get out of here.
Well, we didn't get too into color, so other than looking at the contrast, but it's nice. This is unusual for me personally in modern branding, because we tend to do like a very specific set of colorways. And this does have, there's your yellows and there's your greens, a few different tones here, but there's a, it's more like organic or not random. I don't want to say that because it's not, but when you see them all together, it's not moving in a gradient from one color to the end of the rainbow spectrum. It looks like it's culled from actual examples of the architecture and then popped up a little bit just to be able to be visible. But I find that interesting too, because that does have that retro style and feels in keeping with how he approached things.
It's a good point about bringing up color. This as a brand falls into the case of like museums where your brand isn't the content, but the content of your brand is the content. Like you are the crystal goblet somehow, right? I can't imagine trying to design something over the top of Frank Lloyd Wright and saying, I don't think you can take ownership of that without absolutely trying to put the work at the forefront. And if I think about the portfolio of pieces that he would have had, it would have just ranged immensely, right? I don't think there's one color that could have pulled that in. So it is nice that they're not just giving us black and white plus the photos or a scale of gray or a neutral.
And it's not that common that you see more muted tones, but that very much was in his building. Like, I mean, there's very few brands now I could think of. UPS owns brown. There's Bristol Myers Squibb that has flesh tones, but for the most part, I mean, people don't go there because it's a tricky one to use, but used in the sense for the different buildings and using this, almost, I'm gonna say random again. It's not random, but the assortment, it just has a nice variety to it. Maybe that's a better word for it.
That's a good way to put it. It feels like it adapts to the content really well. I also think each location has the opportunity to have its own sort of collection of color that would feel right. Like we have this slide up that has the Likes house as being listed, and it could like very easily own that sort of tan, creamish, and the materials that get put out about that building in particular could have that tone and its own, building block icon, and then feel like it belongs to the Weissblit house down there. I don't know how to say that. With that like muted blue. So it seems really nice that there's opportunity for all of them to work together, but also house sort of an individual identity within a larger umbrella.
And yeah, that being one of the greatest strengths for this probably is we started off a little bit of a critique to the entry point into the brand itself, but as something that downplays its presence and allows the buildings to go, it's successful in that regard. It very much, says, look at the actual buildings. We're not here to take over. We don't need to over brand this. We'll just let the buildings and the personality of that and the work that's already been done speak for itself.
There had to have been a reason that Order was picked as an agency. You really, really well said, just like, let's not over brand this, but let's make a really beautiful and timeless container for somebody who's going to, in theory, occupy a very particular section of architecture history just till the end of time. And this does a good notion of like cementing it in that time period and showing off the work really well, even if the entry point isn't the most interesting entry point ever. Well, Miles, thanks for talking with me about Frank Lloyd Wright and waxing poetic again about design. I know there's a bunch of projects that we want to talk about or would love to talk about and probably have a hard time finding time to talk about. If you haven't already, though, please like the video, tag somebody who might want to watch it, who might love Frank Lloyd Wright and just want to see the work, hear about the work, or hear about branding in general. Tag somebody who comes in with the stick in the mud and needs to learn how to move it, because man, we are all over the place. We love in some spots, hate in others, and then just moving, always moving.
The opinions midway through,
changing the opinions midway through, evolving, really the way that it should be around art and design.
Mm-hmm.
Like and subscribe as always, and we'll catch you all in the next episode.